Two organizations on opposite sides of the world, both revolutionary in their design, but they could not be further apart in philosophy. Where the UFC holds a single event in 1993, Pancrase holds 4, pumping out a similar cast of fighters every month. It's a testament to the scaled-back brutality as well as the pro-wrestling-driven philosophy that allows this to happen. Professional wrestlers are on the road constantly, wrestle multiple days in the week, and even though it isn't violent concussive blows to the head or strangling submissions with intent to harm, that physicality still takes its toll. But there they are the next night, ready to do it again for a new crowd. There are all sorts of problems with both approaches. Once again, I promise we'll get there, but as 1993 ends, there are two forces in the world that are presenting something that had never been seen before. Real open-style combat. No gloves, and very few limitations. If 1993 was the genesis, then 1994 was when the chaos began to form into the shapes we recognize today. Into the mountains, into the trees, into the signs of life that would grow into men. At Pancrash 1, January 19th, 1994, Pancrase held its biggest event since its debut. Across 4 events, the main pillars of Pancrase, being Ken Shamrock, Bas Rutten, Masakatsu Funaki, and Minoru Suzuki, had demonstrated their superiority, but it was now time to pit them against one another. Masakatsu Funaki, the only fighter among the group with a loss, would face knockout artist Bas Rutten, while Ken Shamrock would face Minoru Suzuki. It's through these fights, and the other events held by Pancrase in the early parts of 1994, that we would see a defining feature of the company: parity. While there wasn't parity throughout the company, within the secular tiers of the roster, anybody could beat anybody. Among the pillars, Ken Shamrock catches an upset loss after a close ground battle with Minoru Suzuki, while Funaki avoided Bas Rutten's powerful strikes to submit him. At the first Pancrase show, it was Rutten and Shamrock who had stood tall. But just 4 months later, the two are submitted by the catch wrestling prodigies. And while the losses were against other top fighters, this left the second son of Pancrase, Minoru Suzuki, as not only the first person to beat Ken Shamrock in Pancrase, but the last to be undefeated. Many people know Minoru Suzuki today for his status as the ornery old man of Japanese pro wrestling. But in 1994, Minoru Suzuki was 26 years old and oozing talent, but he was always second to Masakatsu Funaki. Some of this can be attributed to size. Suzuki at the time was probably 5'9", 180 pounds, while Funaki was 6 foot 200, but he was also just flat out less proficient at his art. Suzuki once told a story where he asked legendary wrestler Abdullah the Butcher, known for his violent and gory matches in Japan, how he could progress his striking to be as good as Abdullah's. This conversation was regarding professional wrestling and making his strikes look and feel better for the audience, but Abby's answer is one that I think demonstrates Suzuki's mindset. Abdullah the Butcher told Suzuki that it was clear that Suzuki enjoyed violence, and that he didn't need to work on investing in this aspect of wrestling because his emotion will show through. As it pertains to legitimate fighting, Minoru Suzuki was a much more violent submission fighter than Funaki. He was much more aggressive in pursuing submissions and utilized more painful holds, hyper-focused on this aspect of the game rather than develop further. Funaki, on the other hand, was a sponge for information. He loved training with the Dutch fighters to work on his striking. He operated with a smoothness and finesse on the ground that Suzuki just couldn't recreate and didn't want to. If you ask the fighters at the time, I think all of them would tell you that Funaki was better than Suzuki in terms of skill. But Funaki's skill didn't lead to him getting a win over Ken Shamrock. Suzuki's brutality did. Back in the United States, the UFC holds a second event. Another one-night tournament, this time with 16 men instead of 8. But without Ken Shamrock or any other significant opponent, this would be another easy victory for Royce Gracie. There is little to note from the event. Royce did face Patrick Smith in the finals, giving a contrasting view of how Ken Shamrock and Royce Gracie could both beat Patrick Smith, but largely, this is filler for Royce's legacy. It's another victory, and a demonstration of how superior he was to the field, but largely, the following months are quiet on both fronts. In Japan, Pancrase's events are lacking major bouts. Minoru Suzuki remains undefeated by beating Takeaki Fuke. Ken Shamrock and Boss Rutan rebound by submitting Ryushi Yanagasawa and Vernon White. And a new series would start, that being Pancrase Road to the Championship. Documentation on Pancrase is even spottier than documentation on the UFC, but using context clues from both the name and the fact that I already know, this series of events was designed to lead into a year-end tournament to crown a champion of the promotion, with the results of the events on the Road to the Championship acting as a pseudo-seeding system to determine where in the bracket you were placed and who you would fight. It remains, to this day, the most conceptually ambitious tournament in mixed martial arts history, and one that we will talk about in depth. First, though, we have to walk the road to the championship. Where Road to the Championship 1 wasn't terribly notable, Road to the Championship 2 is one of Pancrase's biggest little shows. There is a lot that happens here. Remco Pardell, a Dutch jiu-jitsu fighter who lost to Royce Gracie at UFC 2, got a win over Vernon Tiger White. Ken Shamrock beat Matt Hume with a very funny submission. But the top two fights are the ones that will require a bit more attention. First, we go to a fight between pillars. Minoru Suzuki, ostensibly the top fighter in Pancrase at the time as its lone undefeated competitor, takes on Boss Rutan, perhaps the runt of the litter as his experience in submissions and grappling are lacking compared to his peers. For the largest portion of MMA's beginning, grappling dominated the actual win column. You might get brutal finishes like Gerard Gordeau versus Taylor Tooley, but the people who were winning the most were Royce Gracie and Minoru Suzuki, two complete purists who disregarded learning how to strike. While Royce dominated the United States against unprepared rookies, Suzuki came face-to-face with Boss Rutan, a striker who was actually training to get better at grappling, and already you can see the advancements in the sport. Boss knocks Suzuki down almost immediately with hard strikes, and a few moments later is put on his back. In this position, Boss holds Suzuki close, trying not to give up a limb for a quick submission, but also not trying to burst to his feet and opening himself up. Suzuki dives on a leg, which gives Boss enough room to scoot his hips, and as they return to the feet, Boss nails Suzuki in the liver with a knee, flooring the undefeated fighter for the second and final time. At Road to the Championship 2, Boss Rutan gives Minoru Suzuki his first loss in Pancrase, and he did it not just by striking, but by being able to survive off of his back against the submission demon. It's probably the first recorded demonstration of what the sport will become. A marriage of different approaches playing off of one another, not simply switching from grappling mode to striking mode, but a seamless mixture of the martial arts. In the main event, Masakatsu Funaki faces a promotional newcomer. Jason DeLucia is a name that you've likely never heard of, a name that hasn't come up in this project so far, but actually a name you may have seen in passing as Royce Gracie's second-round opponent at UFC 2. If we dive deeper, DeLucia was actually the first win in UFC history as an unaired alternate for the tournaments, and he had fought Royce Gracie before the UFC on the Gracie's in Action DVD. Jason DeLucia is an odd figure, kind of existing on the fringes of space and time, but still being of some level of consequence. DeLucia's role in the story is interesting. It isn't exactly new information to tell you that he will never be the best fighter in the world, nor will he materially influence the forward march of progress. But here, in 1994, DeLucia's role is that of a disruptor. Just 1 minute into his Pancrase debut, Jason DeLucia catches Masakatsu Funaki in a knee bar far away from the ropes that would force a break, forcing the mat genius to submit in an unprecedented upset. There are a lot of ways to digest Pancrase's Road to the Championship 2. You could look at it as a fatalist. Two fighters that had lost to Royce Gracie had gone to Pancrase and beaten their fighters, one of them being a founder of the company, which proves that Pancrase is bullshit and that the United States reigns supreme. You could also look at it as a cultural data point, that the activity and parity that is a result of a more open and flowing style contributes to its fighters' volatility. Personally, I choose to view it as a demonstration of mortality. While there will be a lot of talk about untouchable gods and heroes throughout the years, the appeal of combat sports is, and always has been, that human beings are far more frail than we'd like to think. We aren't always at our best. We aren't always prepared. We aren't always ready for the rigors of life, But what matters is that you do what you can to leave an impact on others and the world around you. The UFC demonstrates this with their brutality. It's a check to the ego of tough guys that you could be killed by anybody. Pancrase, meanwhile, shows this with its equality. There are no gods in Pancrase. There are only men. And men can be scared, men can be hurt, and men can be killed. Road to the Championship 2 proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that Masakatsu Funaki wasn't prepared that night. So, all he can do is dust himself off and try again. 3 weeks later, Pancrase returns with Road to the Championship 3. On the undercard, normalcy resumes. Funaki beats Scott Sullivan, and Suzuki beats Remco Pardell. Higher up the card, we see the returns of Jason DeLucia against Takeaki Fuke, one of the better fighters in the company who's only lost to Pillars, and Fuke lives up to his billing as Pancrase's next best fighter by submitting DeLucia in 4 minutes. The main event of Road to the Championship 3, though, sees one of the classic Pancrase battles. One that does sink into the cultural zeitgeist beyond the 4 sides of this ring. Ken Shamrock versus Bas Rutten may not be the Pancrase rivalry with the deepest lore, but it is one that is built entirely within the world that they have created. Funaki, Suzuki, and Ken are all longtime collaborators and training partners. They have their own internal interactions. But Bas and Ken didn't cross paths until the start of this sport. This fight between them comes at the perfect time. With Ken having lost to Suzuki and Bas coming off of his knockout win over Suzuki, Bas has the opportunity to rocket up to rank 1 in the company by beating a second pillar. However, Ken Shamrock is not Minoru Suzuki. This is crystallized in the opening seconds, when Shamrock stands toe-to-toe with Bas and throws hands with the Dutch striker, forcing Bas to overextend and slip, giving Ken top position. Once the tone was set that Bas had to respect Ken's hands, the fight was practically over. Ken could dominate Bas on the ground, and with Bas hesitant on the feet, Ken could throw freely and shoot takedowns if Bas didn't commit. The fight ends with a Ken Shamrock submission, with Bas giving a great account of himself, but the reality is that he just wasn't ready for Ken. With the result of this fight, there now appears to be a triangle amongst the pillars. Bas beat Suzuki, Suzuki beat Ken, and Ken beat Bas. Anybody that you could claim was the best fighter in Pancrase heading into the championship tournament easily had an argument against them. But with 2 more stops on the road, clarity would begin to take hold. While it's fun to talk about this trio of greats battling for number 1, it was time for the 4th pillar to regain his respect. It was time for Masakatsu Funaki to enter the fray. There are many stories that come from UFC 3, and I promise we will get there. But for now, this is where the UFC is. They have a format, and they run every few months, but some cracks are beginning to show in their foundation. We'll check back in with them later, but for right now, Pancrase's road to the championship is about to end. Road to the Championships 4 and 5 act as a hub for the biggest Pancrase fights to date. While the 2 events fall on either side of the anniversary of the promotion, it's best to look at them as celebrations of Pancrase's year and culture as they book high-profile fights to narrow down the seeding before the year-end championship tournament. The September 1st show sees a rematch of the first main event in company history, with Ken Shamrock running it back with Masakatsu Funaki. In 1993, the bout between Ken Shamrock and Masakatsu Funaki was a great one. 6 minutes of back-and-forth grappling with a feel of gravity that you couldn't replicate to christen this new company. A year later, their rematch was workmanlike. Ken looked lethargic and slow, Funaki is taken down and reverses an ankle lock attempt into full mount, and a few seconds later catches Ken in a choke as Ken rolls to pull off the submission. With the win over Ken Shamrock, Funaki had returned to the fray as a top fighter, holding wins over Bas Rutten and Ken Shamrock. But after a year of fighting and results, it was time. Until now, the 2 Japanese founders, longtime teammates and rivals Masakatsu Funaki and Minoru Suzuki had never fought professionally. Suzuki had been undefeated for longer and had beaten Funaki to the Shamrock win, but Funaki had beaten Bas. The circle between these 2 needed to be closed. The end of the Road to the Championship series takes place October 15th, 1994 at Sumo Hall. 1 year after breaking new ground together, Masakatsu Funaki and Minoru Suzuki step into a Pancrase ring to fight one another. The winner of this fight would surely be the first seed for the championship tournament, undoubtedly the heavy favorite to win. But more than anything, the winner will be the best fighter in the company. Something that stands out after this Suzuki-Funaki bout is the intensity that it was fought with. The breakneck pace of its start, Suzuki's aggressive taunt, Funaki's uncharacteristic ground strikes, and the initial refusal to release the choke when the referee called the bout. It's a story talked about in whispers without much confirmation, about how close Funaki and Suzuki were before the start of Pancrase, and while they remained friends, Funaki trained much more with Bas Rutten and Ken Shamrock than he did with other Japanese fighters. There had been a year plus of built-up tension of these opposing personalities. The violent and stubborn Suzuki blended with the free-spirited and open Funaki, which created an explosive concoction that night in Sumo Hall. When it was all said and done, though, the status quo had been reestablished. Suzuki and Funaki are both great. They are both legends. But they are not peers. When you have a conversation about Minoru Suzuki and Masakatsu Funaki, make no mistake, Masakatsu Funaki stands above. The end of the road to the championship series sees Masakatsu Funaki as the only fighter to hold wins over all 3 pillars, and outside of an earlier loss to Jason DeLucia, has been on the most impressive run in the company over the last year. The final arrangements for the tournament to take place in December had been set. 2 nights, 16 men, single elimination for the title of King of Pancrase. The organization for this tournament is pretty interesting in my opinion. MMA tournaments, historically, have never been orchestrated with things like rankings in mind. They are typically organized by things like random draw, what would make for the most exciting fights, or to protect fighters that you want to make a deep run. Basically anything that isn't akin to seeding. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with this. We're going to talk about a lot of important and fun tournaments in the future that will be organized in very funny ways. But getting the chance to talk about one that is well constructed is absolutely a rarity. If we work backwards from the way that these results shook out, the opening bracket looks something like this. Attached to this bracket is a reverse engineering of how a seeding system might work. Funaki entering the tournament would be the number 1 seed, so his opponent, Todd Bjornathan, must be number 16. Minoru Suzuki, meanwhile, is on the complete opposite side of the bracket, so he would be number 2, making Matt Hume number 15, etc. It's important to realize that these seeds have never been completely confirmed, as again, documentation on Pancrase is incredibly sparse. But what shocks me about these projected seeds is that these would actually be incredibly accurate to the results. Jason DeLucia beat Masakatsu Funaki, so he can't be very low, but he also lost to Takieku Fuke and Bas Rutten, so 7 sounds good. Fuke and Minobu Yamada are underneath the top 4, but Fuke gave Yamada his only loss, so he is 5 and Yamada is 6. I think that the top 8 is dead on, and 9 to 12 sounds good enough. After that, it's kind of splitting hairs. I'm not going to pitch a fit because Matt Hume and Todd Bjornathan are switched. However, from some of the sources that I've read, the way the tournament was seeded was in 4 different pools of 4, with each quadrant having seeds 1 to 4, ensuring that the top 4 seeds wouldn't fight one another until day 2 should they win all of their fights. This explanation comes up a number of times in research, but there is never any citation or source for this, so take it with a grain of salt. But if you break this up into groups of 4, then I think that it makes even more sense. Take this quadrant, for example. If Fuke, Smith, Cook, and Ken Shamrock are in a pool, The worst of those fighters is Cook, which would mean that he would face the best fighter, Ken Shamrock, which also means that Fouquet and Smith would fight, and the winner of those two would fight to make it to the semis on day 2. Extrapolating further, this supports the theory that Ken Shamrock would be entering as a 4th seed, as each pool contains a pillar, a solid fighter underneath, and then 2 shitters. Ken Shamrock's solid fighter bout for the second round is seeded to be Takeaki Fouquet, while Suzuki draws Delucia, Rutan draws Yamada, and Funaki draws White. Regardless of how it's organized, it is undeniably the most artfully crafted tournament bracket in MMA history. From the design to have its best fighters avoiding one another until pivotally important moments, to organizing the optimal matchups, if all goes to chalk, the finals would be a Funaki and Suzuki rematch. But if Boss beats Suzuki again, then Funaki has a chance to beat all 3 pillars in 1 year and gives Boss the chance to avenge his loss to Funaki. Meanwhile, if Suzuki goes through and Ken Shamrock beats Funaki in the rubber match, Ken can avenge both of his losses on night 2. If Ken and Boss upset their Japanese counterparts, then it's another meeting of one of the highest level fights in the sport. From top to bottom, it's one of the most exciting pieces of tournament organizing in sports. I'm telling you, appreciate this, because it's not always going to be like this. There will come a day where the idea of sports is a far-flung mystery, and you'll long for the gushing over Pancrase. But as this road to the championship ends, all eyes are on Sumo Hall, December 16th and 17th in 1994. When the final bell rings and the confetti falls on the end of that pair of shows, there will be an undisputed King of Pancrase. A lot could be said about the first round of the King of Pancrase tournament. A healthy mix of finishes and decisions, a solid spread of knockouts and submissions, and while most of the fights went to chalk, there were a couple notable upsets. Takeaki Fouquet, the best non-pillar in the company and the 5th seed in the bracket, was caught cold by legacy kickboxer Maurice Smith to knock him out of the tournament in round 1. As for the other notable upset, we have to go a bit deeper, because this was not someone who should have lost in the first round. Boss Rutan losing in the first day of competition to anybody would have been unthinkable. But losing in the first round to Frank Juarez, an unknown American in his early 20s making his MMA debut, is inconceivable. Perhaps it's this context of how big of an upset this was that shadows this fight's legacy as one of the more controversial decisions in the sport's early history. I'm not sure what Pancrase's criteria was for decisions. There are a lot of decisions via lost points through their cards, in which you lose a point if you're knocked down or you use the ropes to break up a submission, so the person with fewer points automatically loses at a decision. But without those deductions in this fight, I'm not sure what the judges were looking for. If we apply future scoring criteria and look at things like damage, effective striking and grappling, ring control, attempts to finish, things like that, I would weigh almost all of them in favor of Boss Rutan. The 10-minute bout consisted primarily of Boss entering with solid strikes, including a hard front kick that broke Juarez's nose, and Juarez shooting a takedown and getting top position, where they would sweep position back and forth, but Boss would work to threaten a submission, and whenever he got close, they were too close to the ropes, which prompted a stand-up. In the end, the judges preferred Juarez's consistent takedowns and long periods of top control over Boss's striking and submission attempts, which completely changes the way that this tournament was projected to go. Instead of an all-pillar Final Four, the tournament quadrant Boss was meant to advance from was instead filled by 6th seed Minobu Yamada, who beat Frank Juarez by submission to advance to the semifinals. The rest of the quarterfinals go smoothly. Minoru Suzuki beats Jason DeLucia, Ken Shamrock beats Maurice Smith, and Masakatsu Funaki beats Vernon Tiger White, setting up the penultimate round of the tournament. Minoru Suzuki versus Minobu Yamada, a first-time bout between founder and newcomer, and the rubber match between the 2 best Pancrase fighters, Masakatsu Funaki and Ken Shamrock. While we know the other 3 fighters shooting for the title of King of Pancrase, Minobu Yamada's is a name that hasn't really come up yet. Minobu Yamada is a very interesting fighter. Hailing from Shudo, Yamada has results on his MMA record dating back to 1990, amassing a 7-4-2 record in Shudo, most notably losing twice to Kenji Kawaguchi in title matches for Shudo's 185-pound light heavyweight championship, which, from what I can tell based on dates, was Shudo's last belt in their initial existence to be created. with belts at 145, 155, and 170 coming before, with a large gap until the next belt's creation in 1997. Minobu Yamada went to Pancrase at the start of the road to the championship, going 4-1 with only a loss to Fuke to nab himself a high seed. Yamada's victory over Frank Juarez was a demonstration of both men's proficiency, with Yamada securing top control and scoring an escape quickly, while Juarez roared back to dominate top position and threatened with submission chains. But in the end, it was Juarez's aggression that got the best of him. Down a rope break with 2 minutes remaining in the fight, Frank Juarez dropped for a leg lock, which Yamada capitalized on and got one of his own, forcing his opponent to submit. What Yamada demonstrated against Juarez was an intelligence under fire that is exceptionally rare. Midway through the fight, Juarez had gotten him down and threatened with leg locks right beside the ropes. It would have been very easy for Yamada to grab them and prevent a potential finish or even injury. But if he did so, then he ceded the rope break advantage that he had gained earlier. So instead, he engaged, tying up Juarez's leg and the following submission struggle eventually getting caught in the ropes, forcing a mutual break and resetting the fight to standing, but allowing Yamada to keep his rope break advantage. If there's one person to test Minobu Yamada's composure under fire, it would be Minoru Suzuki. While Boss Rutan is the resident striker of the top Pancrase fighters, Minoru Suzuki's aggression on the mat is second to none, which leads to an interesting style pairing for the semifinals. Minoru Suzuki is a firework. The explosion is real, the danger is present, but that light fades very quickly, whereas Yamada is a brick wall. If there's anyone in the company that can sustain Suzuki's assault and win on the mat, Minobu Yamada would be the man in the tournament capable of that. Minoru Suzuki versus Minobu Yamada on the second night of the King of Pancrase tournament could very well be the best fight that MMA has had in its brief history. There's so much to talk about. Suzuki's dominance to start, Yamada surviving a choke attempt to gain top position and dragging Suzuki to the center of the ring to prevent a break, the tangible edge that Yamada gains instantly by going for a choke and forcing Suzuki to use a rope break, and the mental edge gained when Yamada beckons him back to his feet, all from the first tie-up of the bout. Everything about this fight is interesting, and plays out as a fantastic meeting of the minds at the highest level of Pancrase. But when the final bell sounds, it's Minobu Yamada who has his hand raised, advancing to the finals of the King of Pancrase tournament. The fight's progression goes straight down to expectations. Suzuki's takedowns and control win him nearly every moment of the fight, and he's extremely aggressive with his submission attempts to end the fight quickly. But Yamada endures, always able to get to the ropes naturally so as to not use a break. The fight goes on for almost 15 grueling minutes at the same pace. Suzuki dominating, Yamada refusing to break. Then, Yamada finds an opening. He springs on an armbar and Suzuki taps, almost due to exhaustion more than the pain as he stays laying after the bout. It's an amazing performance for Suzuki, easily one of the best of his career, and if he was dominating anyone else, he probably would have been able to get the submission. But Yamada's endurance saw him to the finals, where he would meet the winner of the biggest Pancrase fight to date. Masakatsu Funaki and Ken Shamrock have been in a dead heat for the race to the #1 fighter in Pancrase since day one. While Minoru Suzuki was beating lesser competition and remaining undefeated, Funaki and Ken were sharpening their teeth against one another. When Ken stumbled against Suzuki, Funaki stumbled against DeLucia. When Ken rebounds over Boss Rutan, it's Funaki who's there to send him back to the losers column. The two have traded wins and status back and forth. Ken Shamrock is better against the field, while Masakatsu Funaki is the only fighter to hold wins over all of the other pillars. Stylistically, Ken's size paired with his dominant top control seems custom-made to beat Funaki's flowing offense. But in their rematch, Funaki caught Ken cold and submitted him quickly. Pancrase in 1994 has shown an immense amount of parity, which is boiled down to its two best fighters. They've traded wins, either man can win on their best day, But to decide the winner of their series and the other half of the King of Pancrase tournament finals, they would have to go through one another. Funaki versus Shamrock 3. Winner take all. Ken Shamrock left no doubts. In a fight that wasn't in question from the moment they locked up for the first time, Ken Shamrock took Masakatsu Funaki into his world and drowned him, submitting him in less than 6 minutes. For as important as the fights between these two are in the early days of MMA, and especially in the founding of Pancrase, I would argue that Ken and Funaki's bouts contain the least amount of drama of any pair of fighters. On the aggression scale, both of them fall much more on the side of passivity than Suzuki or Boss. And since the two have trained together so extensively, both of them know how to shut the other's game down. Where Funaki and Suzuki just ran at one another, and Boss and Ken have disparate approaches to the sport, Funaki and Ken just never blended into anything classic. Their bouts aren't necessarily boring, especially not by the standards of the time, but they are more like filing your taxes. You gotta do it. The results of it could very well be important to your life, but there is nothing dramatic or explosive about filing your taxes. The meeting of Ken Shamrock and Minobu Yamada is about that struggles to live up to the moment that it is. This isn't an enduring classic from the dawn of the sport. This isn't a meeting of two iconic titans. It doesn't have a big finish. It doesn't define this era of Pancrase. It's a meeting between two fighters, one of whom absolutely belongs here, and the other who went on a Cinderella run. In the coming decades, we will become accustomed to the reality that MMA is so rooted in that denotes it as a place where miracles come to die. This is not a sad moment, but if you came in expecting a classic that you've never heard of between Shamrock and Yamada, you weren't being realistic. Minobu Yamada's style is one that just gets gutted against Ken's. His endurance and intelligence gets completely suffocated by Ken's dominating top control. And unlike Minoru Suzuki, Ken Shamrock is not going to get tired because he's going to make Yamada wear every bit of his 200 plus pounds, but also keep Yamada from getting active in order to force Ken to tire himself out. There is never a single moment where Ken Shamrock is on the bottom or even in a disadvantageous position. He was far and away the better man against a woefully outmatched opponent. This is a lot of doom and gloom that can give the impression that this wasn't an amazing feat. It absolutely is. Ken Shamrock looks every bit of the best fighter in the world in December 1994. And by winning the King of Pancrase tournament, Ken achieves a feat that marks a moment in history. MMA's first ever traditional championship. There are all sorts of weird landmarks where time is defined in MMA. 1993 is when I consider formal MMA history to begin. 1997 is when traditional championships are typically tracked to. 2001 is when MMA's modern day begins. You could basically pick any one of these dates and cherry pick history. If we jump about 17 years into the future to 2011, Jon Jones becomes the youngest UFC champion ever at 23 years old. This is a weird piece of history, because what of Jose Aldo, who won the WEC championship at 22 when WEC was owned by the UFC? And by being the WEC champion, he was awarded the inaugural UFC featherweight championship the next year. Technically speaking, yes, Jose Aldo wasn't a UFC champion, but it was his win of the WEC championship that allowed him to become a UFC champion. It's a silly distinction, and one that I'm equally guilty of by denoting the King of Pancrase championship as the first ever traditional championship in MMA. Since I start my history at 1993 and am all but ignoring Shudo, I am completely disregarding 4 championships in their various weight classes. It's arbitrary, it's ignorant, and it's the truth. I don't know how Shudo operates. I said that from the start. And while Minobu Yamada's origins from Shudo can be argued to legitimize their talent and thus their lineage, even if we consider their championships, they are not heavyweight championships. There is no heavyweight. Not yet. For now, there are tournaments being held in the UFC, and there is the King of Pancrase Championship. Royce Gracie does not defend his UFC 4 tournament victory in his next fight, but Ken Shamrock can and will have challengers for his spot as the King of Pancrase. At the end of 1994, there are 2 titans standing across the sea, the UFC's Royce Gracie and Pancrase's Ken Shamrock. The two of them met at UFC 1, and it was Royce Gracie who triumphed. But the success of Ken Shamrock since then has dwarfed Royce's victories over untrained bar fighters. The two of them have created legacies across 1994 that position them as the two best fighters alive. And another meeting has to happen in order to break the stalemate. However, what you might have missed is that they were supposed to.